Folks, as you know, social media censorship is growing. The best way to support our video work for Israel is to subscribe to our video newsletter on pulseofisrael.com and to share our videos. If you are already a subscriber, then thank you. Shalom, shalom everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland, the beautiful Judean hills of the land of Israel. Today we have a very, very special and important program. I will be speaking to Rabbi Shalom Hammer. And this is about a topic that to many of our in society today is still too much taboo. We're referring to mental health and suicide. Yet it is so, so important for people to be able to have the information available to them to help themselves, to help their loved ones. And this is what we're going to be talking to Rabbi Hammer about today. Shalom, shalom, Rabbi Hammer.
Hi, shalom aleichem. How are you?
Baruch Hashem. It is really, I was going to say a pleasure to have you. It's a pleasure to have you to talk about this really, really important topic. And just to give people some background, just last week I heard you at a live presentation you gave, and you give this presentation a lot to communities, to organizations, about your own daughter, Gila, who died by suicide at the age of 18. And it is just wonderful that you've taken that painful tragedy that you and your family experienced, and in addition, obviously, to experiencing it, and it's now a part of your life story that you always have to deal with, but you're using it to help as many people as possible. So, and that's not easy at all. So thank you on behalf of everyone who will be listening, who is listening, and can hopefully be helped by you.
Well, thank you very much. As far as there are two things with regards to that introduction. The first is that, God forbid, when somebody is faced with what we could really recognize, and no one should ever know, to be the greatest or the most just astronomical tragedy, a catastrophe that could befall someone, i.e. the death of a child, the loss, demise of one's child. As from my perspective, the only real option is to commemorate their memory, and as much as possible to have them continue to resonate in this world, at least in what we would call a spiritual sense. So I really, by the time the Shiva period had finished in mourning for Gila, one of my missions, and I'd probably say the forefront mission, was to preserve her memory by commemorating her through lectures, awareness, presentations that people should understand, should be able to help others really save lives, and be able to help others heal. That's firstly. And secondly, with regards to what you mentioned as far as the difficulty, yeah, I mean, every single thing that we do, certainly that I do in the morning, and my wife and our family does, is a whole different dimension of difficulty, hardship, obstacles, and obstructions. So, but with that difficulty, with that handicap, at the same time, we hope and pray that what is preserved is the ability to act and to promote, as I said a few moments ago, and that's where we're at now.
Understood. I guess before we go into the actual information to help people, are you able to just tell us a little bit about Gila and her specific situation, that from that people can learn from?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, basically it's a fairly I would say in mental health it's a fairly short story, because she really suffered for a period of about 1.5 to 2 years. But what she experienced, she had been through a very serious traumatic event. And classically, trauma or a serious trauma typically can lead, if it's not treated, and it's very important to mention that it has to be treated as quickly as possible, recognized, identified, and dealt with as quickly as possible and as close as possible to the trauma itself. But trauma will typically lead to anxiety. Anxiety leads to depression, and depression can certainly lead to suicide attempts or suicidal thoughts. And that's essentially, without sounding coarse, God forbid, what happened in Gila's case. She had gone through a very serious trauma. It took a while for us to start to identify, and started expressing certain anxieties, fell into a depression, was very, very insecure, very self-afflicting, and had a very poor image of herself that started to develop. And as a result, slowly but surely, that depression just didn't give her that glimpse of hope that she needed to be able to continue. Now, I say two things that are important for people to recognize. One is Gila was an outstanding young woman. She had an amazing, magnetic personality. She was a social butterfly. People were attracted to her. She was a movila. She was a leader within the chevra, within the social spheres. And she was very, very loved. And usually anyone who met her had great difficulty forgetting her in a positive way. And I say this because it's important for parents, for educators, for people in communities to realize that you can look at someone who seems to have a magnanimous personality, but it's quite possible that they could be suffering from depression. And they can really spiral in a very fast way. And that's really what happened with Gila. The second thing is that with regards to who she was and being that type of person, she went from being someone who was so open, vivacious, rambunctious, to becoming or finding herself into a place of dark despair. And for us as parents to see this child who was so vibrant, who was so lively, who was so attractive, to go into a place of depression and of sadness and torment was obviously terribly painful for us.
So I guess it's important. I mean, from your experience, you could break this down into two different avenues. One, in terms of a parent having to want to provide and help as much as possible a child of yours, and then the second avenue is just a person experiencing mental health and going down that avenue. So let's just start with the first. I guess what do you wish you knew or had to be beforehand that you believe could have helped you and your wife helped Gila better in a sense, or quicker?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, there are many, many things that come to mind. Unfortunately, for example, in this country, suicide is not approached. It's not broached. It's not really spoken about in an open way. Now, I'm not suggesting that we have to walk around speaking about it. That's also could be a precarious situation. But one has to be aware of it. Certainly, the professionals. And when a person exhibits certain behaviors, it would be helpful to know that those behaviors are patterns that can lead to suicidal tendencies. So, for example, self-harming, when a person afflicts certain injury upon themselves, that is not an absolute sign that there is going to be suicide, but certainly is a sign or a cry for help. And if that help is not answered or not addressed in the proper way, it certainly can exhibit itself in a tendency towards suicidal ideation. So that's just one example. Knowing about suicide, knowing what it entails, knowing what the signs are of people who behave a certain way that could lead to it. When I give my lecture, when I give my talk, at the end of the talk, towards the end, I give out warning signs of suicide. And basically, it's a list of 11 signs that are blatantly obvious or that demonstrate that a person certainly has a tendency to explore that avenue of suicide, if you may. And within those 11 signs, only after the fact did we realize Gila had 9 of them. Why did no one ever say to us that, beware, be careful, she's in a very bad state, she needs to be in the emergency room? But rather than get that, when we would bring her, for example, a number of times to psychiatric care, she was very quickly discharged a number of times within a day. And there's no way that a psychiatrist, for example, in a hospital, in a psychiatric ward, can make an assessment with regards to a person's safety in the 20 minutes or half an hour that they meet with a person suffering from a mental challenge or mental illness and decide that they should be discharged. It's a very, very difficult thing to understand or to comprehend. So suicide is something that I think we certainly could have been more aware of. Also, the signs of depression. Obviously, we knew that Gila was going through things. Thank God we tried to be as good parents and alert as possible. But had we known the information that I know now about, for example, patterns of depression, that when a teenager exhibits certain patterns of depression, that's something that you really have to be very wary about and be careful about their behavior and follow them consistently. And what happens is many times to parents who deal with adolescents, because many times depression exhibits itself in adolescence, is there tends to be this kind of like gray area. Is this just a teen acting like a teen, which all of us know typically they can seem depressed or want to be in their room for hours at a time, or close themselves off with their phone, et cetera, or at the same time, is it really someone who is exhibiting patterns of serious depression and challenges that may lead to something, or is and should be considered something much more serious? So these are signs, indications that I've researched afterwards and only found out more about after the fact, even though Gabby, certainly my wife, and myself, we tried to keep abreast and tried to read and understand as much as possible. But if there was someone who really gave us those signs and explained to us in a very real manner of what exactly they could lead to and what exactly they were indicating, that obviously would have been much more helpful. I'll give you another example, Avi, which might sound strange to people, but I've learned since. Now, obviously, when you speak about, for example, suicide, one has to be very careful. It's a very tenuous subject to approach. Having said that, if someone, God forbid, is, and this I'm saying only to someone who's peer-to-peer, a colleague, a friend, someone that you know closely, okay? If you realize that that someone is suffering immensely, and you might think that they are contemplating a certain course of action that could be dangerous to themselves. And it's important for us to note that people who suffer from mental challenges are usually more dangerous to themselves than they are to anyone else. But if you get that indication, one of the most important questions to ask that person, again, very carefully and with caution, is, are you considering killing yourself? Now, it sounds...
You should ask that question, you're saying.
Absolutely. And the reason why I say that, you see, to us, and even to me, when I first heard this and learned this, I said, wow, I mean, how can that be? If anything, we should avoid it. We should have mentioned it. It's, it's the dark horse in the room. And the answer is no, because what the person who's suffering most from mental health challenges needs is empathy. Someone who understands them, someone who can see them, what we call in Hebrew, begova einayim, eye to eye, peer to peer, friend to friend, loved one to loved one. And when you ask that question, you are basically alleviating a huge burden that's sitting on their shoulders that they're afraid or hesitant to express to anyone because of they're afraid of the reaction. And yet when someone comes to them and asks them that question, what they're saying is, I understand you. And I realize that that's a possibility. Let's talk about it. Here's someone that I can relate to. And that's why it's such an important question. That's an example of something that I never heard of before. The psychiatrist, for example, when we had mentioned to her or asked her, and this is actually the day that Gila died, when Gila was with us and she waited outside the room. And when we asked the psychiatrist, who had been with her for a number of months now. What do we do if Gila says to us that she's thinking about this course of action? She said to us, the psychiatrist, she said, tell her that that would be like causing a terror attack on the family. And now that is something that you should not say, because then what you're doing is you're taking
the professional psychiatrist told you to something that you've since learned should not be said.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because what you're doing is you're piling more guilt upon someone who already feels guilty. That's something you should definitely not say. And I don't believe it doesn't exhibit any empathy. So that's just one example of something where, because it remains a taboo in society here in Israel, and because it's not spoken enough about, and there's not enough direction, certainly given to the people who are suffering and their loved ones, unfortunately, tragic consequences could certainly follow if that's the case.
Wow. It's interesting that you mention that, because talking about this brings back memories to myself, because I had a close relative who also had mental health issues and depression. And I remember, like, the one thing we always used to say to this person was, we love you, we're here for you. Like that, just those type of messages. I don't remember anything, or at least for myself, nothing more, nothing less. I guess because I remember like walking on eggshells, because you don't know what to say. But obviously trying to give over the positive and the hope. Again, don't know if that's helpful or not. But that's what I remember myself focusing on and saying in any situation where I felt it was necessary to give over.
Yeah, I mean, there's no. Sorry, you were going to go. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to follow up, but it makes me feel sad that more than that, I didn't know. I didn't know who to talk to and ask, well, what am I supposed to say? How am I supposed to correctly talk to this person? I didn't. It was just going on my own intuition. And it makes me feel very sad. Like, wait a second, why didn't I reach out to a professional and say, hey, I want to be able to communicate, and this is the situation with this loved one. What should I say? What shouldn't I say? I didn't even know who to go to.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, there are a number of things with regards to that. Firstly, obviously, when you're dealing with a parent to a child, you know, there's an issue of, you know, desperate time and attention and love that you want to give that child, and you want to save their lives. And I'll say like this. Firstly, what you said at the beginning is 100% correct. And that is what you really want to first demonstrate to the person is love and empathy. I'm there for you without anything that could sound patronizing. So sincerity, understanding, and empathy are the main ingredients that first have to be exhibited. That's number one. Number two is a follow-up to that. And that means that, you see, what we have to understand, Avi, is that the majority of people, the majority, not all, the majority of people who die from suicide do not want to die. They want to live. And they want to have a productive life. And they can have a productive life. People who suffer from mental health issues absolutely can have productive lives if given the proper care. And that's a large part of what I'm trying to preach, and what others preach as well. It's not just me. But what has to be given to them, and the reason why I say that the majority of people don't want to die when they attempt suicide, is because if they are given, the point is, if they're given a glimmer of hope, if they're given some type of framework, some type of a glimpse of light that can make the whole difference between life and death. And the moment that they see that there is something out there, that they have something to anticipate, and that they have something that they can participate in or certainly contribute to, that is the moment that they can very well say to themselves, I'm not taking this course of action because there's something out there for me. The problem is that when too many doors and opportunities, if they exist, close or are slammed in their face, that's the moment that they keep growing more and more into despair. And
what are you referring by that? What do you mean doors of opportunities that close in their face?
Well, it's very important for someone who suffers from depression, for example, to have a framework. Now, it's very hard to get that person in depression to go into the framework because they have no motivation. But even if there's something that they can grasp onto, for example, going to a gym, working out, going to a job part-time, taking a course for a few hours a day, anything, or even helping someone out, anything that they have that can give them that statement that you're still a person, that you still have what to give, that you still have what to offer, that you can contribute to society. That's very, very important. Even if it's not in the most productive way that you and I know that they can, or that they know that they can, as long as they're, so to speak, part of a program, they still have a greater chance of reminding themselves that they're here and that they are able to be productive. And maybe one day they'll be even more productive. And maybe one day they'll be able to continue to be able to give over and to be able to be a part of society. So it's very important that we give them that glimpse, that understanding of hope.
So I want to touch upon something that you brought up. Again, for people out there, whether parents or loved ones or friends, and they want to talk to professionals to find the information to help them in their specific situations. You right here in this talk right now brought up how you got some horrible advice from some professionals. And in your talk, you even expanded upon that of even more stories of horrible advice and no help from people that you were the professionals, whether psychologists or psychiatrists. How can someone know that the psychologist or psychiatrist they're turning to is someone who's giving them the good and necessary information and not damaging information like some of the professionals and the advice that you gave?
Well, I mean, listen, I mean, part of the problem is that you don't always know. Look, I always explain that when people say to me, oh, that person is a great therapist, right? First of all, there's one problem here in Israel, and that is that everybody's a therapist. First of all, everyone's Jewish, which makes everyone a therapist right away, right? So where, as Jews, we like to give therapy to everybody. That's part of who we are. So anyone basically in this country, there's very little control with regards to who can hang out a shingle and say that I'm available for therapy. I myself know people who start organizations and who offer services who at first glance even, I would say, are not really qualified to give over therapy or to deal with someone who is in a very precarious and dangerous situation. In other words, I know people who call themselves in the field who I would tell you wholeheartedly I would not trust a loved one who's in danger and who's suffering with this person. And yet there are many out there. So there's no control, or there's very little control, I should say, in Israel with regards to who can hang out that shingle and offer that service. That's number one. Number two is that there are unfortunately even those who call themselves professionals who, as I said before, are not informed enough. So, for example, the woman who was the social worker in charge of Gila's case really was not informed enough in terms of the services that were available to her. Now, just so you understand, I do speak English, but we live in Eretz Yisrael. We live in Israel now 31 years. I am extremely Israeli-sized, if you may. I work in the Israeli army. I work with predominantly Israelis in Hebrew and motivating troops, etc. So I'm full-fledged in Israeli society. And I will tell you that the people that we dealt with were Israelis, hardcore Israelis, born here, bred here, educated here. And for example, this young woman who was a social worker for at least 10 years, she was completely uninformed with regards to the services that were available to Gila. So what would happen is that Gabby would go Yomam Valayla 24/7 on the computer looking for options for Gila, looking for things that she could do. And she would find out, oh, this service is available for her. Why didn't the social worker tell her? She'd go back to the social worker and the social worker would say, oh, yeah, you're right. She could have. I can arrange that. So basically, Gabby, my wife, she was doing a large part of the groundwork that should have been done by the social worker. So that's problem number two. People are uninformed. There's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape in much of the process, as many things in this country, and therefore it really is an obstruction. The final thing I want to mention, Avi, and this is important for all of us to know, is that, look, so many people today go for therapy and go to therapists. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this segment, I said, you know, people will say, oh, you have to see that therapist. They're the best in the country. Well, my question is, for who, right? What works, you know, what's good for the goose is not necessarily great for the gander. In other words, what might work for one person in terms of a therapist might not be effective for another person. So it really depends on chemistry. The person sitting in front of you might be very good for one person, but not good for the other. And the second thing is that there also has to be consent. In other words, the person going to the therapy has to want to be helped. They have to want to have and be a part of that therapy. If they're not actively participating in the therapy, or at least willing and have a desire to be there, you can be in front of the greatest therapist, however you would call it, in the world, the most trained, I should say, or experienced therapist in the world, and it will not be effective.
That's actually a very, very important point, that it's the chemistry with the right therapist to be able to get help. So up until now, I mean, we've been mostly focused in terms of a parent of a child, an individual who themselves has the self-awareness that they have a mental illness, that they possibly are having suicidal thoughts, and they want help. What is the best advice to give those people?
It's hard to answer that question on two folds. Number one, it's hard to answer that question because it depends who's sitting in front of me. So everyone, as Chazal say, everyone is olam and olam bifnei atzmo. Everyone is, Adam v'olamo, is his own world. I remember one of my rabbis, Rabbi Wein, used to say, in the ideal world, everyone would have their own yeshiva. By the way, I think that's almost exists today. But the reason why is because everyone, needs to be tailored to a custom fit. Certainly when it comes to mental health, which is such a struggle to figure out what's troubling the human mind, what's lurking within the human mind, if you can, it really depends on who the person is. So one of the things that I'm working on, and there are a number of organizations working on it, and the reason why I say that is because what I'm trying to do is to collaborate efforts. I want to create an association where, many of the organizations will work, get a load of this, in unison, together. Perhaps something that never happened in the Jewish world before. But I think obviously two heads or a bunch of heads are better than one. And if we could discuss, compare, engage in dialogue, it'll be that much more effective. But one of the things that it seems to be a recurring theme that repeats itself is a navigation system. People have a very hard time navigating or knowing where to go to, who to see, when to go to them, at what point. And what I'm trying to do is to create a navigation. I call it navigation to salvation, a navigating system where not only will it help perhaps people get to where they need to go to and give them suggestions, and it's not therapy, but to give them that guidance, but also cutting out those places that they should not go to. Okay. So what happens in mental health is, I always say, it's time is life. The less time that is spent on the bureaucracy and the process, the more time you can give for the person to get help. And the quicker that person gets help, or at least believes that they are getting help, the longer their life is preserved. So that's number one, the guidance system, the navigation system, helping that person kind of figure out the options that are viable and that are not. So I hope that that's something that will develop. There are organizations that already offer this service. I'm not sure who and what, and if they do it very well. It could be they do. I don't know enough, but it's certainly something that needs to be reviewed and something that needs to consistently be reconstructed. The second thing is that we have to, when you meet with that person and that person comes and says, I'm going through this or I'm going through that, it helps to have certain resources of people who know the system. So what I'll typically do when and people do come to me, and I want to emphasize, I am not a medical health professional by any stretch of the imagination, which, by the way, the fact that people come to me, that itself says something. They shouldn't be coming to me. They come to me because, Nebuch, we have gone through the tragic consequence of losing our child to suicide, and they know that we've researched it before, we research it afterwards, and that my response is activism. So I try to, what I basically try to do is not to give them exact answers, but I try to contact the people who might be able to provide them with direction. And again, it depends on who it is. But like I said, there aren't the greatest right now in Israel. There aren't always the greatest of options, but there are options out there, and we have to try and find them.
Any other points that you'd like to add that I didn't touch upon, I didn't ask about, that you feel is important that I possibly missed?
Well, I think one of the things that you see, I explain to people, I go around speaking and presenting, and it's not just because I love to hear myself. And believe me, certainly now I do not love to hear myself, because what I'm speaking about is the loss of our dear Gila, our dear child. But one of the points of going around speaking is breaking the stigma. The more that we talk about things, the more that we're open about things, the more that we discuss and engage in dialogue, the greater chances there are that we will be able to present more options. And there'll be more pressure on those involved in these issues to step up their game. So it's very important. And people sometimes will say to me, what's the next step? What are you doing next? Well, sometimes I'm not sure, but I know that the first step has to be to bring awareness. Why? Simply because if we bring awareness, there might be someone out there who hears about it, who says, oh, I do have a viable solution to that problem. And it begins as such. It begins in the dialogue. It begins in the speaking. It begins, I don't know if you remember in your parents' generation or grandparents' generation, they would never say the word cancer. It was like a taboo. They would call it the machala, the sickness, as if it wasn't to be uttered. And we know that with time, cancer is not going away. But the more that we speak about cancer, thank God, the more research there is, and the more some of the cures are coming about as a result and evolving. So this is the same thing that has to happen with regards to mental health. This is the same thing that has to happen with regards to mental health and mental illness.
And correct me if I'm wrong, you have this new course that you've started to help educate and get people on board to be mental health first responders, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
That's correct. I'm involved in a number of efforts, and I'm not looking to recreate the wheel. but I am looking to be active. So one of the efforts, as I just mentioned, is my lecturing, my speaking, my presenting. You can go onto my Facebook page, Rabbi Hammer. It's Breaking Stigmas, and you'll see a lot of information that I give out, that I disseminate for people to read about, to become more knowledgeable. There's an ability also to contact me directly on the Facebook page, and I will come speak wherever, whenever. It's very, very important for me to present that message, to give it out there in Hebrew and in English, or both. And so that's number one. Number two is, yes, there's a fellow named Stuart Katz who runs an Amuta called Ogen, and he's a very, very impressive person, very intelligent, also proactive, the kind of person that I like and gets things done. And he introduced a course called MHFA, Mental Health First Aid. And we brought it over. He was the main instrument in bringing over this course from Australia. It originated there. And just like there is first aid as a first responder, Rahman al-Islam, to a physical ailment or a physical emergency, so too there is now a first aid course for a mental emergency, for someone who is not, so to speak, grounded, someone who is in a state of disarray, or even in a state of danger. This course teaches a person to be a first responder and to bring, or how to bring that person back to themselves, grounded, calm, and then to be able to bring them to a better place for therapy or whatever it is that they need afterwards. So it's not to be a therapist, it's not to diagnose, it's to be a first responder to someone who is in danger or who might have some red lights that are flashing. We have the capacity to be able to direct them and guide them as such. The course was brought to Israel. Israel now is the 29th country that has this course. It is fascinating. It is fantastic. It is only certified to those who take the course. There are people out there who claim that they give the course or the course is available through themselves. They are not certified, and it actually is illegal. This course has been certified through MHFA. There are only 12 of us in Israel now currently who are certified to give over this course. I and my partner, Ruchi Bromberg, will be giving over this course for the first time in Israel's history this Sunday. This Sunday, July 4th, will be the beginning of the first course in Beit Shemesh. This course is available all over Israel, and people are contacting us consistently to be able to give the course. And what it will do is, not only will it help people or enable people to be a part of saving others' lives, but it will certainly bring more awareness. It will disseminate information. It will break those stigmas. The third initiative I mentioned is Navigation to Salvation, which I mentioned before about creating this navigating system. The fourth initiative that I'm involved in is to create an association whereby all of the organizations will collaborate, will be together, a meeting of the minds. And I sincerely hope that it will work. I hope that egos will be put aside. I believe most people, I would almost say almost all, who are involved in mental health and in saving lives and in helping people therapeutically, they should not, and I imagine they don't have egos that stand in the way, because they're involved in saving lives. And that's what's important here. So I hope that we have this meeting for the association, and that we'll be able to compare notes and at least meet consistently and see how we can collaborate together as one. And finally, I do want to mention I have a new book that is coming out. It's called Spread Joy for Gila, Gila's Way. And it's 5 children's stories, all based on Gila's life, all based on episodes that happened, because it's important for us to know that Gila was a most remarkable individual. I have to say that I've seen this consistently with many young people who have died from suicide. I listen to interviews, I compare notes, I speak to people, and unfortunately, people who lost children, we tend to kind of gravitate to one another in this kind of closed club, a club that none of us want to be in, but a club that exists because we're the only people who can understand one another. And what I've seen is that the vast majority of young people who die from suicide and who suffer from these illnesses tend to be very similar personalities.
Really?
Very social, very giving, very kind and loving and joyous. And it's quite remarkable. They're like outstanding characters. And yet they suffer. And maybe part of it is because they're so emotional and so concerned with other people around them that they bear the burden and the weight of the world is upon their shoulders. Those are the kind of people that they are. Gila was that kind of person. She was so a fantastic, vivacious, lively, and giving at the same time that I felt it important to encapsulate and capture who she was in a children's book that would be most appropriate, because she loved children. And it's an animated book with 5 stories. Mirta Hashem, God willing, it'll come out, I hope, by the beginning of this year. There are many kind friends who help sponsor it. And it should be a wonderful way to teach children as well the concept of empathy and being sensitive and aware to the people around you through vis-a-vis Gila's way that she lived her life. I just want to mention, Avi, I'm so sorry that people, I apologize. I know I'm just rambling, but I just wanted to mention people are more than welcome to visit my Facebook page, to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Rabbi Hammer. Every week I post a video of the Parshat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion that relates to mental health and to projecting positive images. And I will now be addressing on that YouTube channel video shorts answering questions that people have with regards to mental health in what could be, hopefully, the most practical of fashion. So I just wanted to mention that. No,
sure. I'm glad people are now know about it, to be able to get assistance from those avenues as well. And I just wanted to touch upon something you just mentioned that is scary but fascinating, but I'm really happy you just mentioned it, and I imagine other people as well, that you just said that the pattern of most young people who commit suicide is that, in essence, they're the last people you would think of committing suicide. Happy, social, responsible, and I don't know about other people, but I know for me, that just like was a huge aha moment, because I have a friend who I was in yeshiva with and the army with. He became an officer, one of the most responsible, well put together of all of my friends. And a number of years after the army, he committed suicide. And to this day, I could never wrap my head around why him. He was the one most responsible. He was the leader. Everyone followed him. Everyone listened to him. He didn't have any issues standing up for himself. No self-confidence issues. It never made sense. And with you saying, like, wait a second, there's a pattern. Well, yeah, he fits right into that pattern. And I guess that's a big aha moment for everyone, because it's not the one you see in the corner necessarily who's the one that potentially is the most dangerous, but one of the leaders who, if something happens to them that you don't necessarily know about, and they won't necessarily talk about because of their position and stature, and then just burden it on their own, they're the ones that might be in the most danger. That was like, that's a real aha moment.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. I just want to quickly mention that you use the term commit suicide. I always correct people.
Sorry.
And no disrespect. No disrespect.
I'm glad I made that mistake, because I wanted to ask you to talk about it, and instead I made the mistake myself, and it gives you the opportunity.
Okay. Well, no problem. I'll just mention, you should know, by the way, you're not only the only person who made that mistake. I've spoken to psychologists, and I've seen on websites, actually, about mental health. Just yesterday, I came across a website, and on it says commit suicide. And we don't use that term anymore. And the reason why is because commit implies that someone committed a crime. And you should know, even from a rabbinic perspective, as you do know, okay, years ago, people who died from suicide were punished. They were buried in different parts of the cemetery, out in the outskirts of the Jewish cemetery. That is no longer, because there's an understanding now that mental health, it's an illness just like any other physical illness, physical ailment. It might be more complex and it might be more difficult to identify because it's the human mind, which knows no bounds. But at the same time, someone who dies from suicide is suffering. And as I said, they want to live. They just find themselves in a unfortunate consequence and predicament that they can't crawl out of. And this is the only option, if you may, that they entertain. But they don't commit a crime because they're suffering from an illness. And so that's why we say a person died from suicide, a person was lost to suicide, those kind of expressions. As far as the personality goes, you say a very, very vital point. And that is, when you're looking for someone who is, or I'm not saying you should look for someone, but when we look around us and wonder who is suffering from a mental illness, which, by the way, 1 out of every 5 adults suffer from. Okay, so that's a huge proportion, a huge portion of the population have mental challenges, and there's nothing wrong with that. We have to deal with it, and we have to help them. But the point is, it certainly very, very well may not be that person that you're looking at that's sitting in the corner, that's not talking to anyone. Those are symptoms that might exist, yes. And they are symptoms that we have to identify. For example, with Gila being this social butterfly, obviously when we saw her, crawl or shy away from a social scene, that certainly has to be a sign or an indication that there is a problem. But it's very often a personality or someone that you don't expect that are suffering from it. I mean, just to give an example of someone that everybody, might have, heard of, like a Robin Williams, who was, seemed so social, so happy.
Happiness personified.
Yeah, I mean, the personification is that he was like, out there and he's making millions, he was rich and wealthy and happy but no, internally he was suffering. So these are internal strifes that a person experiences. And I'll also mention one of the things that you just mentioned in your comment, that sometimes people would ask us, with regard, like friends of ours, they would say, why didn't you tell us about what Gila was going through? Because many of them, after she died, many of them were really in shock. Like, this is a lovely, beautiful young woman who seemed to be so happy and seemed to be so, kind of like go with the flow and into things and involved. And how can it be?
Wait, but meaning they saw her during those 2 years that she was suffering, and they still were surprised? Correct.
Because when Gila would go out, you couldn't necessarily tell that there was something wrong with her. She was social. She tried, and there were many things that she had challenges with. And, if you looked not even that closely, you would see that there were, but to someone who just saw her in passing, they would never know that there was something wrong with her. Right. And the reason why I mentioned that is because last night I gave a lecture and someone came over to me and she said, look, I have someone that I know whose child is suffering, but I don't want to pry or stick my nose in their business. And it seems like the parent is not so interested in speaking. What can I do for them? Or why aren't they responsive to me? And I said to her, look, a person whose child, thank God, is with them and is going through things like this, they have to invest a vast amount of energies and a vast amount of time. And it's exhausting into this child, to keeping them alive and to getting them care and to getting them assistance and aid. And that's why I told some of our friends, look, it's not that we didn't tell you about Gila because we opted not to speak about it. You see that I'm an open person, an open book. And so is, thank God, my family. But and everyone has their own way of dealing with things, but that's the way we are. But one of the reasons why we couldn't speak to people is we had to save our energy and store our energy for the people that needed to hear in order to help Gila. So it is very exhausting. And we all of us out there who see families who are going through this, or are struggling with a child who's out of the box or different or challenging, we have to be aware that that's not just the person, the child that's suffering, but the whole family is going through a serious amount of investment of energies and exerting a huge amount of emotions that can be absolutely exhausting. And we have to be understanding to those families as well. Michal Voldiger, member of the Knesset now, her first speech that she spoke about in YouTube, she said, you know, it's not just the approximately 150 to 200,000 people who are suffering from mental illness that are being affected in the country, but it's at least 500,000, because you count also their families and their relatives and their colleagues and their friends and their workplace. And you have a huge amount of people who are also being affected by that. And we have to be aware that we have to give support to those people as well.
Right. Listen, we have a comment here that I think you will appreciate, and I'd love to hear your feedback. It's from a woman named Jenny, and she's focusing on depression. She writes, the point is that depression is still looked at as a weakness. And she writes, sorry, I have had major clinical depression for 27 years. I deal with it. Therefore, I consider myself a very strong woman. The majority of people still believe that depression means that people feel sad for a time. They are so wrong. Depression for people who suffer is that it is what you deal with every day. The mornings where one doesn't want to get out of bed. Well, the morning when you do get up, that is strength.
100%. I will tell you more than that. I have a friend of mine who suffers from deep depression. He's very open about it. He speaks about it, lives in Israel. And he has said to me, and he said to people publicly, he says, you know, telling a person who suffers from depression, stop it. Can't you just be happy? That's like telling someone who suffers from migraines, just take 2 aspirin and you'll be okay. Now, anyone who has migraines, Shalom Edah, no one should have them, but they know that if you pop 2 Tylenol, it's not going to take the migraine away. The migraine consistently festers and continues to trouble that person. It's the same with depression. Someone who suffers from depression are not suffering from a headache that can go away. It's something that is ongoing and consistent. And the definition of depression, by the way, is exactly that. It's not an episode of being sad. It's a sadness that haunts that person and can be debilitating to that person consistently. Now, on top of that, there's a very short film called The Black Dog on YouTube. It's a cartoon. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long. It's put out by Australia. And it's a very, very revealing film about depression. And I want to mention one of the things that they say there that always struck me is that take even a regular, an adult, but certainly take an adolescent, a teen, who for them image and self-image and socialization is so important and so forming and so and so effective on that person's life at that particular time. And what they're doing when they're suffering from depression, not only are they dealing with their own depression, but they're also dealing with trying to hide that depression from their friends, from their peers, from their schools, from their families. They don't want to be perceived as having a problem until they can come to terms with it, hopefully. So imagine the amount of energy that they are exerting, not only on their illness, but also on covering up their illness. It's absolutely astounding that they still have the strength to confront the day. So they're confronting the day, as this woman Jenny mentions. Their ability to get up and face the day takes far more superhuman strength than the average person. Right. And yeah, we have to recognize that.
Right. No, yeah, and thank you, Jenny, for adding your personal anecdote that is so important for everyone to hear, and I'm glad that Rabbi Hammer got to give his insight on that as well. Final question to end off. Want to go a little more generic with you for a second. Here, a message that I give over, both from a religious Jewish perspective and just a life perspective, is that each and every one of us in life will deal with tragedy. We're all going to deal with different tragedies, whether it's just the tragedy of the death of a loved one, even naturally, it's still a tragedy. And obviously from there, it gets worse. But no one lives a life without feeling some sort of tragedy, inevitable. What advice can you give people on how to move on? How to continue knowing a tragedy that your family experienced? It stays with you. It doesn't go away. It's now a part of you in different ways. Life's changed. It's not the same as before in whatever way. How does one have the strength to deal with it and move forward with that tragedy now part of their life?
Wow. We could do a whole other interview just on that, right? But
yes, sir.
You know what? I'll end with that with which I began. And I mentioned at the beginning the answer to that question. I'll say it again. And that is, first of all, in your question, you said an interesting thing. You said, how do people move on? And I'm very sensitive to those words.
I know. I tried to walk it back.
I'm sorry?
I tried to walk it back to reframe. 100%.
It's okay. You're setting me up. It's fine. But the reason why is because I heard a lecture, and I forget the name of the person, but she spoke about, she also is going through bereavement and grieving. And she spoke about how those who grieve never should use the word move on, because move on implies that you can forget yesterday. So obviously we don't have someone who's grieving, never ever has the capacity to forget. And they shouldn't. And I don't want to. And part of the struggle, I explained to my kids, part of the struggle that I have is walking between life and death. Because on the one hand, I walk in death because I want to embrace Gila. I know that she's physically not here, but I want to feel that she's here. And one of the things that we say in grieving, for example, is many people are afraid to speak about the person who died. And in actuality, that's completely wrong. Most of the time, not by everyone, because grieving, there's no one formula, but many times people who lost a loved one, they want to speak about that person who died. And the reason why is because when you speak about the person who died, you're confirming that they're still alive. When you choose to ignore, so to speak, and not to speak about that person, you're actually confirming that they're not with us anymore. And this goes back to answering your question. And that is, Chazal, the rabbis tell us in the Gemara and Brachot, Tzadikim afilu b'mitatan nikra'in chayim. Righteous people, even when they are no longer alive, are still called alive. What does it mean? And it obviously means that if that spirit of that person resonates with us and continues to teach us lessons and continues to guide us and be with us. When I go into a lecture, I turn, for lack of a better word, to Gila and I say, come on, Gili, come along with me and I'm going to speak about you. And when I'm finished, I turn to Gila again and I say, thanks for being there with me. And thanks for helping me out. I apologize for my emotion. But the point is that as long as that person's spirit resonates with us and continues to escort us through our efforts, that would be the advice that I give a person. I can't tell a person how to react because everyone has their way. But I believe that in some form or fashion, if we take that person's spirit and allow it to continue to resonate with us and with others in this world. And it's amazing how many people Gila still educates, even after her demise, then I believe, for me at least, that is the only source of comfort that I can have.
Rabbi Hammer, thank you so much for opening up. Thank you for your emotion. I think people, I'm okay. I'm okay with admitting to people that I have a feminine side and showing emotion. And I believe most people appreciate that as well, and appreciate your openness on this whole issue, especially with opening up about your daughter Gila. So a big thank you for myself and for all the listeners, and hopefully people have grown and been educated to be better prepared, whether they're dealing with something in their lives today, or to be more prepared to be on top of things and issues if something comes up in their lives with friends or loved ones. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And we should only meet on joyous and happy occasions, and all of us should enjoy and love and embrace our families, personal, and the family of Israel, the nation, and all people of humankind. And I thank you very much. We should know good things.
Amen, amen, and B'atzlacha Rabbah with all of your educational activities. And again, anyone interested in reaching out to Rabbi Hammer, go to his Facebook page, just search for Rabbi Hammer. And obviously, if this interests you to bring to your community or organization to be educated and raise the knowledge level of people, then reach out about inviting him. So please, please don't be bashful and do it. You don't know whose life you can save. All right, Rabbi Hammer, thank you very much. All right, everybody, thank you very much for tuning in today for, again, very special and important episode about a topic that doesn't get spoken about enough to really educate people and bring people on board to be better prepared to deal with whether themselves or friends or loved ones who are experiencing mental illness and potential suicidal thoughts. If this was valuable to you, please share the video. And if you want to continue receiving Pulse of Israel videos, just go to pulseofisrael.com and sign up for our video newsletter. Signing off for another episode of the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland. This is Avi Ablo, and thanks for watching. Shalom.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.